Hey everybody, we've got a great show for you this week. In just a few moments, I'm going to cue up my interview with writer Joe Kelly, all about his early 2000s Action Comics run. We talked about finding humanity in the characters, including Lex, Joe's original intention for his version of General Zod, the Elite, writing the finales for all of those storylines of that era, and a lot more. And yes, I even asked about Ignition. If you're new to Digging for Kryptonite, or if you're returning to us after being away for a while, welcome or welcome back. And if you're here specifically because you're interested in Joe Kelly and his Superman work, I highly encourage you to dig through our back catalog. Specifically, we recently spent about 9 episodes revisiting the Jeff Loeb, Joe Kelly era of the Superman titles from the early 2000s. We had a lot of great, comprehensive discussions about that period of Superman. So if you're interested in that, I think you'll really enjoy those episodes. Please make sure you subscribe to Digging for Kryptonite via your platform of choice so that you never miss an episode. And keep tuning in the weeks ahead. We're going to have a bunch of big, fun, standalone episodes as we barrel towards the release of James Gunn's Superman. And in honor of Joe Kelly being on the show today, we're going to drop a special bonus episode this Friday to complete Joe Kelly week. I'm going to welcome back my pal Mike Sangregorio, who was just here last week for our epic Jimmy Olsen discussion. Mike and I are going to discuss Joe Kelly's 30-issue run on JLA with artist Doug Mahnke. This included the storylines Golden Perfect, The Obsidian Age, and Trial by Fire. And we'll also hit on Joe and Doug's maxi series, Justice League Elite. So enjoy this interview with Joe Kelly. Make sure you come back on Friday for our bonus episode. Keep tuning in, and thank you very much to everyone for being here. And now, after a word about our sponsors, my conversation with Joe Kelly. Aw Yeah Comics celebrates everything that is wonderful about comics, toys, artwork, and the joy they bring to people. Visit them in person at one of their 3 locations, Harrison, New York, Muncie, Indiana, or Skokie, Illinois, home to our pal, Sweet Sweet Bernie. If you have children and have been looking for a family-friendly store, look no further. Join Aw Yeah for exciting events, including creator signings, how-tos, and more. Visit awyeahcomics.com and follow them on social media. Their name says exactly how they feel about it. Say it with me now. Aw, yeah. We love digging into epic comic book runs, but what about the art of the single issue? Single Bound is a new podcast series hosted by married couple Amy and Logan as they review single issues of comics. And if the title also makes you think of Superman, you're not alone, as the Man of Steel is Logan's favorite character and a regular topic of discussion on Single Bound. Listen and subscribe on Spotify and YouTube, and follow the show on Instagram at Single Bound Podcast. This podcast is an affiliate of BCW Supplies. The next time you need to restock on comic book bags, boards, boxes, and more, be sure to use promo code FSP to save 10% on your order. That's FSP for Flat Squirrel Productions. It helps support the show too. Thank you. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to discuss his classic Action Comics run is writer Joe Kelly. Joe, welcome to the show. It's an honor to have you here.
Hey, Anthony, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me, and I'm glad to be here.
I'm excited. I have so many questions. One of the things I was struck by recently was the fact that it's been over 25 years now since you first took over the writing of Action Comics. And I was wondering, in terms of fan interactions online, at events like conventions or store signings or whatnot, do you find folks are still eager to talk about that chapter of your career? You've done so much over the course of it, but do you find folks are still eager to talk about Superman? And then within that, and I can probably guess, but within that, what aspect of your Superman work do you find garners the most questions or conversation?
Yeah, I've been so lucky, to be in this industry at the time I was in it. I missed the window of like gigantic, insane money that I missed by a couple of years. So that's okay. But I was very lucky to be where I was and when I was, and people do still ask me about Superman. They do bring it up, and I'm sure that you would guess if we said it at the same time, it's Action 775 is what comes up the most, which I'm obviously always happy to talk about and very proud of. And it's always interesting. I just did this Ask Me Anything on the League of Comic Geek site, and there were a lot. It was like 100 something questions, which was awesome, and more than a handful of them were about Superman and specifically 775 and whether or not it was relevant today and all that sort of stuff. And I love it. It's cool that is an ongoing conversation. So yeah. I'm thrilled. And when you reached out, it was like, okay, this is going to be, I love talking about this stuff. It's a great time. Superman is one of those characters I don't think about often until he pops up, and I'm very glad he exists and very glad I got to play in that sandbox,
Yeah. It's one of those things. The continued interest in Action 775 is certainly well-deserved, and I share in that. At the same time, I'm always quick to say, Joe Kelly's got so many bangers in his Action Comics run. I mean, the second issue in your run was the Wonder Woman 1000 Years in Valhalla issue. Mm-hmm. In terms of anniversary issues, Action 800 that you wrote is so beautiful and so moving. I reread it earlier today, and I was tearing up as I was reading it. So,
thanks.
So there's so many greats within that run. But yes, of course, Action 775, understandably so. I guess while we're on that subject, is there anything that you feel, or any misconceptions that you feel fans have had about that work in terms of questions that you've gotten over the years or conversations that you've read or heard? Anything that you want to address on that front?
No, not really. I mean, I feel like the only thing that maybe people would ask about that was never an intention was whether or not I had any personal beef with anybody. And I think on occasion that sort of pops up, and I've always said it's pretty obvious to especially if you were reading comics at the time, that the elite are based on the authority. I mean, I used to not say that, right? I used to back in the day just be like, well, people like dark superheroes. Whatever. I was reading the authority. I love the authority, and I really enjoyed it. There came a point where something happened in an issue that made me want to write 775, but I never had any kind of beef with, Mark Millar or anybody. Like I said, I'm a fan. So that's the only thing that's ever come up where I've always been like, no, that's not what this was about. The beautiful thing about these books, and about this, this medium is that there's room for everything. There's room for, truth, justice, and the American way. There's room for, heroes are fascists, and let's look at that. There's room for all of it and everything in between. And maybe those are the same thing sometimes. Who knows? But yeah, that's I think the only thing that's ever popped up. I'm trying to go through my head of criticisms or anything, but no, that's pretty much the only thing that ever I think came up where I was just like, oh, I don't want people to think there was a personal thing behind it, because it wasn't.
Understood. And I think it was in that AMA, because I did have a chance to take a look at it. And perhaps you've said this elsewhere as well, but I think I saw it there where you really talked about this idea of hope versus cynicism. Mm-hmm. And that resonates. And that is, I would say, generally the way I look at Action 775 as well, rather than a condemnation of any particular group or title or creators or fans or anything like that. Really more the idea aspect of it.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I couldn't stress enough how much I like dark stuff, and whenever we joke about Man of Action, there are four of us, right, that in my company, and I'm the smiley guy, and everybody will admit I am the darkest one out of the group. I have some dark stuff in my head, and I'm attracted to dark art, and stories. So Yeah, it's never about that. It really, that story came out of just the idea that I had a feeling that there was a sentiment out in the world that if you believed in a hopeful hero or a hero who could survive in this world without killing villains or any of that stuff, that you were naive and possibly stupid, right? That it was such a childish way to look at these characters that, you were there for a child. And so that was what kind of spurred me on to go, we don't really want that out of all of these characters. There are some characters that exist for that purpose. Superman's not one of them, and for me, and so that was the impetus for writing the story. What's been really cool is that over the course of time, that has evolved, like not just my own perception of the story, but it's sort of a story that, like, as people find it, they can apply current world views and what's happening to that. So it can be hope versus cynicism. It can be, do I want certain types of content in my comics, real world versus escapism. Like, there's so many things that are in there. And I love that. I mean, that's, I certainly don't, that's not like me patting myself on the back. It's just sort of a happy accident in terms of when you deal with archetypal characters, Superman being one type of archetype, the Elite being another kind of archetype. You can get those conversations over many, many years, which is cool.
I appreciate your thoughts on that. It's one of those things over the course of our discussions of your run and the larger Loeb Kelly era, as we refer to it. One of the things that's been very consistent that my guests and I have shared in, and I've heard from audience members as well, is I think a very clear vision of the character that you have and that came through in the stories. And yes, of course, in Action 775, also in that Wonder Woman issue, in Ending Battle, in the end of Emperor Joker, in so much of your work. And one of the things I wanted to ask you, big picture, what were the stories in comics or otherwise that really shaped the way you came to see Superman, even before you took over the writing of it?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. It's funny, when I was hired, they asked me, like, well, what do you know about Superman? What's your favorite Superman? And I said, honestly, it's the movies, is the truth. I had the very first comics I ever owned were in a box from my uncle. It was just sitting at my grandmother's house, and he was like, here, you want these? And, they're all dog-eared and whatever. And there were a bunch of Superman comics in there. And so, I read them a bunch of times and liked them, but I didn't have a strong association with them, with the exception of Crypto. And when they would do these stories where they would read Superman, they would do like Tales of Krypton, where they would read Superman's mind with a machine, and you see him like as a flying baby with Rabbit and things like that. Like I remember the fun, silly stuff, right? But just as a hero, those books didn't really stick, in my mind. But the movie, Christopher Reeve's, original Superman stuff, formative, very formative for my childhood and for my sense of what that character could be and could represent. And then obviously as you grow up and you start then, have my own kids, sharing it with them, and what does it mean, and getting to watch that evolve over the course of time, came to mean a lot. But I really did come to the character with kind of just that. It was the movies. Certainly the TV shows were in reruns, but that's such a weird time capsule, even, in the late 70s, that I wouldn't say that was as formative as the Christopher Reeves.
Gotcha. It's funny because I came across an old Wizard article from around the time you guys took over the Superman titles, and it mentioned you being 28-year-old Joe Kelly taking over Action Comics. And I know I read that article back in the day. And when I was in 7th grade reading that article, I'm sure I felt like, oh yeah, like that's an adult, like it's right. Now, as a 38-year-old, I look back at them like 28, he's a kid.
No, if I knew any better. That's the beautiful thing about being young is you just yeah, sure, I'll do that. Like you have it's not even no fear. The sense of responsibility is always there, especially on a big character. I'm not that crazy, But when you're in your 20s, you're just like, sure, I could handle this. I know I have barely any life experience, but I'm sure it'll be fine.
So how did the gig come your way? How did you end up on Action Comics?
Well, the crazy true story is that Steve Siegel and I were on the X-Men, and he wrote Uncanny. I wrote Adjectiveless X-Men. Our run ended earlier than planned because we quit. That's a story for its own thing. And then, Eddie Berganza liked Uncanny, but got us confused and asked me if I would be interested in Superman. And I didn't find that out for a while. Like, it's not like he said, hey, you do a great job on Uncanny, because I obviously would have said, no, that's Steve. But he had asked, he had approached me about Superman, and, did I have thoughts? And that's where this conversation started. He knew me from Deadpool. So he just sort of swapped places of the X-Men. And then I found that out later. And I remember saying it to Steve, and, if you know Steve's work, especially with It's a Bird, he actually did not have like any sort of deep love for Superman. So when I told him, he's like, that's fine. I hate Superman. It doesn't matter. And it took him a while to find his way into that character. But that was how I got offered the job. And coinciding with that, certainly I know Jeff was pulling the strings a little bit behind the scenes. I think he had put a bug in Eddie's ear about it. Because he had called me and was like, hey, would you be interested in doing this? I didn't really know him, Jeff, at the time. We became very good friends after the fact. But it was just him sort of approaching, knowing that there were multiple books and they were going to be in rotation, and just asked me if I'd be interested in doing that. So that was really it. So a little bit of a, dumb luck, got my foot in the door.
That's so funny. Well, it all worked out, and Steve Siegel ultimately did get a Superman run a few years later. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about is the way the creative teams coordinated and worked together, because this was still technically part of the Triangle era. The books, for not the entirety of your Action Comics run, but a substantial portion, did continue to bear the Triangle numbers and then eventually the Shield numbers as it morphed. But I do understand that it functioned differently than it had before. And even just in terms of the stories, reading it, you could tell the books had a bit more autonomy than I think the previous Triangle era creators had. Of course, you guys came together for crossover stories and whatnot. Famously, the prior incarnation of the Triangle era creators, they would have their super summits once a year and map everything out on big boards and whatnot. I was wondering how it functioned for you guys.
It was very similar. We definitely would get together and do summits, and it was always a great room. Everybody was super fun, and we had a really nice time. I mean, I enjoyed working with everybody, and Mark Schultz was just a sweetheart. Always like super kind and very generous with ideas, and DeMatteis, I was a huge fan. Like, that was one of those moments where I'm like, oh, you're responsible for some of my favorite comics, and I'm like in the room with you like that. I would have those moments, which was really cool. He was also incredibly sweet and generous. So yeah, we would sit there and cook stuff up. And I guess the difference being, we would talk about like, okay, where are the big flashpoint moments where we're going to have a crossover and it's going to be a big multi-part story. And if it's Our Worlds at War or whatever, we, start to cook that up. And then it was, okay, what ideas are people enjoying that they sort of want to pepper on the road to get there, that either might inform that, you kind of reverse engineer some stuff, or it would just be like, all right, you've got, 8 months to do whatever you want. How can we all help each other? And then you sort of start to break it that way. But I remember it being fun. The room had windows, which is always it's always a plus. Yes. You get into enough of these rooms, and when some of them don't have windows, you go like, oh, this is rough. I don't know. I'm in a submarine right now, and this is not pleasant. But no, it was always very fun. And then certainly later, then Steve was involved, and Joe, and when the team shifted.
Yeah, having just reread all of it, knowing that it was building towards Our Worlds at War, and you see the seeds being planted with Imperiex right from the jump. So I really appreciated all of the thought and planning that went into it. The other thing upon this most recent reread that really stood out to me, it gave me even more appreciation and respect for your role in the process. I know no one writer had an easy task, But I'm saying to myself, Joe Kelly, every time there's one of these big events, he's the one who has to land the plane. He's always writing the concluding chapter of Y2K and Critical Condition and Emperor Joker and Return to Krypton and Our Worlds at War and Ending Battle. And so I've been dying to ask you just how you approach that, how you navigated that process. Was it something you relished? You really liked the challenge? Was it daunting? A little bit of both? I welcome your thoughts on this.
Yeah, sure. It's definitely a little bit of both. And if anything, you almost, after a while, you feel a little bit of guilt because you're like, oh, I get to, like you said, I get to land the plane. Like the hard work has generally been done up to that point, right? If we've done our jobs correctly, especially in pre-breaking these stories, the last issue is like, you don't want it to feel like a fait accompli, obviously, right? You want the feeling of as much suspense and drama as possible. But at the end of the day, it's usually literally the last punch and then some wrap up, right? And then it's, maybe the denouement goes into the individual titles. But so you go like, oh, I get kind of some of the big moments. I get the big payoffs. And after a while, you start to feel a little bit guilty. Like, oh, what, do you want to end it early? Like, do you guys want that? But it never shifts that way. Just generally speaking, I don't remember if it always kicks. Oh, you would know better than me. If it always kicked off in action and ended in action.
It always kicked off in Superman and ended in action.
Got it. Yeah. So, and in the same way, it's like Jeff would get to do, some big fun kickoffs and start the mystery or start the exciting thing. He'd have the big, like, oh, wow moments. And then I'd have these big, hopefully oh, wow moments, but in the closing argument. But yeah, we figured that stuff out together. And then the way that usually works is like, if you have enough plot movement, everybody's sort of zeroing in on, oh, I have an idea on that. I have an idea on that. And you try to arrange it so that they fall into their books,
In terms of those kind of big tentpole crossover stories, the ones I just rattled off, like Y2K, Critical Condition, Emperor Joker, so on, were there any of those that you were really behind, even more so than the others, that maybe you were really spearheading and you were rallying the others to get on board? Or I guess the flip of that, were there any that you remember where someone else was really pushing for it and you were like, I don't know, and maybe needed a little convincing or anything?
I think Emperor, I feel like, and Jeff might have just recently, because they just re-released Emperor Joker, hardback and stuff. I feel like he was crediting me with coming up with some of that idea. And maybe that's true. Like I have such a terrible memory for that stuff. Like once everybody's sort of at the table and we're all playing with the toys, I'm not good at going, oh, who did this and who did that? Other people are much better at it than I am. But Emperor Joker, I know definitely had a lot of stuff in it because, like I was saying before, my sort of dark sense of humor really got to come in for that stuff. So I felt like I had a lot to add there. But no, none of them, I don't feel like any of them off the top of my head were, I was ever anti or sort of bummed about, like it's funny, Y2K having the first like computer generated character in a comic book was really interesting because it simultaneously felt cool and also was like, oh, I don't know if that's going to look good, like trying to balance that out. That always stuck in my head a little bit, but it was of the time, so that was fun. Worlds at War certainly got plenty dark, which is stuff that I could really sink my teeth into. Ending Battle definitely had a lot of dark in it, and to get to sort of wrap the Manchester of it all, was cool. That very much felt like, okay, if I started the conversation in 775, I finished it in Ending Battle, and that was very good for me. So, maybe I pushed a little bit harder on some of those, but I just don't really recall it that way,
Gotcha.
Yeah.
On the note of Emperor Joker, of course, with Action 775, what's so funny about Truth, Justice, the American Way, you got to adapt that work in an animated film, which was terrific, and you got to flesh it out even more. When we talked about Emperor Joker recently, we kept coming to this idea, how has there not been an animated adaptation? I know Batman Brave and the Bold, they did a bat-centric version of that, but we haven't gotten a full-on version of Emperor Joker, and it feels like it would be a perfect fit for an animated movie. To your knowledge, was there ever any talk of that?
Yeah, I don't know. No, I imagine if there had been, especially after I had worked with them for the, Superman versus the Elite, it would have popped up. But I don't recall there being that conversation. And I have a feeling that it is the weird fiefdom of, oh, well, he's a Batman villain, not a Superman villain, even though that's part of the fun, right? That's part of the whole gag of it. But the it would be awesome. My son and I watch a ton of cartoons together, mostly anime at this point, but that Justice League version of Batman Ninja is coming out, or just came out. And I can't wait to see it. But in Batman Ninja, when the Joker shows up, he is so scary and so well done in that art style. And you just see, as a character, he just works all the time. And so then you give me that overpowered version of him in animation. Oh my God, it'd be so good. It'd be so good.
Yeah. Another thing, Emperor Joker related, although it goes beyond that I've been dying to ask you. So Emperor Joker introduces the character Ignition, who Emperor Joker doesn't recall creating. And then Ignition makes his way back to the regular reality and becomes part of the Imperial Guard of the Zod of Pokolistan and is in the books for a while. But to my knowledge, we never see Ignition fully unveiled or get an origin story. And so I'm wondering, do you have that worked out? Is that something you can share? What was the deal with Ignition?
I'm trying to remember. I have a feeling that we did have a lot of it figured out after the fact. I think in the beginning, it might've been just oh, it'd be cool to have at least one of these characters slip through the cracks. Nobody can take responsibility for Joker didn't create him. Who is he? Kind of stuff. And I honestly don't remember. I really don't remember where Ignition came from. I remember breaking Ed McGuinness's shoes about giving him pants, the way that he did, that he just had normal pants, and that being hilarious to me, and us having a good laugh about that. But no, I really liked Ignition. I thought it was a good character. It's fun, but I honestly don't remember. I'm sorry. I wish I did. If we had a better backstory for him or not.
Oh, that's quite all right. When my guest and I were talking about it, he was convinced because I guess there's a panel where maybe the helmet starts to come up a tiny bit, and he was convinced there was anti-monitor sort of energy going on. I said, I don't know. I said, but I'll ask if I ever get the opportunity to.
Yeah. No, that's great. No, I'm sure that we would have backed into something. I don't know if it was there in the creation of that character, but we definitely backed into something with him. But I honestly don't remember what it was.
I know I'm getting very specific here, but we also had a debate in that episode because at the end of Emperor Joker, Bruce is really broken after everything that he's endured during this altered reality. And my understanding of the finale has always been that Superman took Batman's memories into himself, into Superman. Right. Although my buddy was convinced that Superman stuffed the memories in Joker. And I said, I don't think he would. Although we do end the story on Joker in a kind of catatonic state in the asylum. But just on the record, I just wanted to confirm or clarify what your intention was with the end of that.
Yeah, my recollection of that is that Superman took it into himself, because I think that there's a follow-up somewhere along the line, right, where Bruce is pissed. Yes. And he's like, you don't get to do that. I need that pain. That's mine, and so that is my recollection. I think Joker being sort of fried at the end, as I recall, was more of the release of the power and sort of being left vacant by it. But yeah, I always felt Superman took it into his own head. That's what I recall.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that was always my interpretation, but I was curious to get your take on it. This is more of a big picture thing, but there are so many scenes and moments throughout your run that felt so natural and organic and lived in and just really kind of brought the pages to life. And I'll give a couple specific examples. In your second issue, the Wonder Woman story, it kicks off with a scene that I think married people, or even if you're just in a relationship, can identify with, where Lois is teasing Clark about who Superman would marry. And it's all fun and games and it's playful. And then Wonder Woman shows up and all of a sudden it gets real. And just kind of that sense of having that sort of playful teasing debate with your significant other. And then it takes a turn and you're like, oh, like now this is an actual problem.
Right.
Or there's a page, it's the issue with, it's a Smallville is burning on the cover. And this is during the point in time where Lois has been replaced by Parasite, but no one knows this yet. And she's acting weird and Clark can't make sense of it. And that issue opens with, and I'm not blowing smoke, I swear this is a perfect page. This montage of the sunrises that Clark and Pa have shared together over the years. And you see the passage of time and these heart-to-hearts that they've had. And there's one where Clark clearly has snuck out. Maybe he messed up the car. He's gotten in trouble. He's been grounded. And Pa says, like, I hope it was worth it. And Clark is like, Pa, actually it was. And in that issue too, he's getting counsel from both Jonathan and Martha about how they've navigated hard times in their own relationship. And I felt like something like that went beyond what you often can get from Jonathan and Martha, where it's this pithy, earthy wisdom and it's great and we love it. But this felt very real. We get this bit of business about how Jonathan would go out and break stuff when he was angry. And it all just felt so real. I don't even know what the question is, but I mean, were there specific, not to get personal, but were there specific things you were drawing from, or I don't know, just sort of goals or approaches to that? Because it made such an impression. It was so resonant.
Oh, I mean, I'm very happy to hear that, especially, sort of in a retrospective way, because that was definitely my job, like part of the pitch of what made each of the books different. Like Mark was focused on sci-fi, like that was part of his thing. And Jeff was like the big superhero stuff, for sure. And for me, it was like putting the man in Superman, like that was the focus. And then it's funny being 28, I was like, well, what I have to offer is I'm newly married, like I got married when I was 27. I had been married for a little bit of time but it was obviously still new. And even though I know my wife for a very long time prior to getting married, we were a young couple. And so I was like, since as long as Lois and Clark are together, can we sort of focus on that? And there would be times where, Braganza would call me up and be like, so how are things at the Kelly house? And we're like, oh, fine. Why? He's like, this script where Lois and Clark are kind of fighting. And sometimes it would be literal like lines that my wife or I said to one another. So that I definitely am that writer. Like I pull stuff from my life all the time. I love, obviously you use your imagination, you dramatize stuff, but Ma and Pa would be like the best possible versions of my parents, like sometimes it would be stuff they actually said. Sometimes it would be stuff I wish they said, it was sort of sitting there and trying to figure that stuff out. They're much more in touch with their feelings than either of my parents were at that time. And then the Lois and Clark stuff was always, it was stuff directly from my life. And, there's, I forget which issue it is. There's the Walking Midnight thing. It's, where oh my God, that was the next thing I was going to bring up. But go for it. Well, that's, I used to do that. I used to do that. And I know that my dad would do it. Like I know that my dad walked around the house and made sure we were all, my dad was a cop and he had he carried a lot of what would now be called PTSD from being on the job, even though I think he would have been the first to tell you he didn't see a lot of like quote unquote action. You know what I mean? Like he's a regular Nassau County cop, wasn't a, big city cop. He never pulled his gun, but he saw a lot of bad and it made him fearful, and he was a worst case scenario guy. So the idea of, I remember him telling me at one point, walking in to make sure that we were alive was like a thing that he would do for my brother and I. Because he couldn't go to sleep if he didn't, and so that sort of stuff sticks with you. And then you have an opportunity to bring that out and go, okay, well, how do I, and I certainly was not, I didn't carry the same weight, obviously, that my dad did, but you get brought up a certain way and some of that stuff finds its way in. So, I know for a little while, certainly when my kids were new and it was, you have babies, you can't help but get a little freaked out once in a while and go poke your head in there and just make sure everyone's breathing, all that stuff. But that's where that came from. So that stuff was always, and again, it's that sort of, the old chestnut of like when new writers like, oh, how do I start writing? And they used to say, write what you know. Me and the guys at Man of Act, we stopped saying that a long time ago. It's like, you got to write who you are, and it doesn't matter what you're doing, whether you're doing Superman or Spider-Man or any, it doesn't matter or your own characters. And when I would look at the book of, from the point of view of, okay, young married couple, or, project myself into Pa Kent and go, okay, how do I take my dad, but done in a different way? That's who I am. It's, some of it is what I know, but then it's, twisted into, okay, now I'll take my perspective on the way my dad acted and what could I have done better, or what could he have done, quote unquote, better if he had certain tools. And that's where that stuff comes from. So long way of saying, I'm really glad that stuff still resonated.
100%. I'm so glad you brought up Walking Midnight. So that's from Action 810, your final issue, and it's this New Year's Eve issue. And yeah, this idea of Jonathan walking midnight and checking on everything before going to bed, and the parallel being that Clark does the same thing, except his walking midnight is a lot larger because he has the whole world to look after. I have quoted that issue and that walking midnight idea so many times on the show over the years. I have lived it myself. When you talk about checking in on a baby, do the exact same thing. I always want to make sure they're breathing and, just part of the routine. But I always love that idea. And it felt, I knew it had to have come from something very specific. It had that feel to it. And I love it. So I'm so glad you brought that up.
Oh, that's cool. Well, thank you. I appreciate hearing that. That's really cool. And I'm glad. Thanks for reminding. I knew it was a New Year's Eve issue. I didn't realize it was my last issue.
Yeah, you brought everything full circle because your first issue started with Dr. Spectro, if memory serves, and then you brought him back for the end. By the way, so you were on the book from, if my numbers are correct, Action 760 through 810. How have we not gotten, and who do we have to write to get an Action Comics by Joe Kelly omnibus? Because I feel like even if we filtered out the crossover issues or just included some text explaining what was going on in the other books, either way, there's more than enough for a really beautiful volume here.
I appreciate it. And I would love that. I would love for those stories to come back up. I think that, again, in a way that is not meant to throw shade at anybody, after our time was done on the books and sort of, Jeff Johns came in, and this sort of new shakeup happened, I think they just sort of wanted a clean start. And then the momentum of that, and then what happened, and how Jeff rose within the company and all that sort of stuff. It's sort of like there is a before and after, and again, I like Jeff. It has nothing to do with, it's nothing personal. I think that there might be a bit of we don't fall into like a weird dead space, but it is kind of like there's the stuff with Superman before that time period, but not far enough to be, classic. We're in this weird spot. But hopefully somebody will just go, hey, yeah, let's take a look at that stuff and bring it back.
It's one of those things whenever it comes, obviously we bring it up a lot on the podcast, but talking about it and posting about it on social media, there are always people who come forward like, oh, I love that period of time. I love that era of the Superman books. But also I think sometimes the sentiment of like, oh, I haven't gone back to them in a long time or I haven't thought about it. So yeah, maybe it does somewhat fall into that space, but that's why I love whenever we can shine a light on it. So I know I asked you about kind of how it functioned during that portion of the Triangle era. There comes a point, it's right after our World's at War, where those Triangle, or again, Shield numbers by that point, because they were using the full Superman shield, went away. Mm-hmm. And at that point, there were still the occasional crossovers like Return to Krypton 2 and Ending Battle, of course. But for the most part, it really felt like the books were off on their own more than they had been before. Did you have that sense as well on your end?
Yeah, I think so. I think that if I remember correctly, it was just sort of like a conscious decision of again, like change was in the air, right? It's like they had done this sort of that numbering system for a long period of time. It was time to shake things up. The creative team was shaken up also internally. I'm trying to remember what, I think that was about the time also that Superman movie came out. right? The Brandon Routh movie.
Well, that was 2006. So the triangle numbers went away, I think, early 2002.
Okay. So because there was definitely something that was connected to Hollywood around the same time that I know that Steve was on, which I feel like is kind of the time we're talking about. Because we would get told, the very first thing I was told was when Superman gets a haircut, you're on the cover of Time magazine. So don't pull any of your Deadpool crap and try that. That was something that was made very clear. And then, talking to Carlin about what happened with Death of Superman and the Lois and Clark show and all the kerfuffle from that was fascinating. I mean, I just found it to be amazing. So we did get told at certain points, like, yeah, don't make any waves right now. They're working on a movie, and I feel like it was around that same time. So it wasn't like a lame duck period, but it certainly there was just change in the air, and so I feel like, yeah, maybe we had done a bunch of the, super connected stories and it just felt like, yeah, let's go a little looser, in that regard.
Gotcha. I think it was in that AMA you talked about a dinner that you had with Mike Carlin.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that? Because it seems you had a specific vision and plan for this version of General Zod from Pokolistan, and it didn't go that way.
Yeah, well, I was really hoping that we would, introduce Zod and we pull off the helmet and then he looked like Clark, and it's like, oh, what is he? Is he a clone? Is it whatever? And sort of in a melding of some of the science stuff, from kind of Man of Steel era, and then kind of my, more classic take of Krypton, sort of mushing them together and going, yeah, he, Zod was really going to be the brother, like, of Superman. And whether or not that meant, I think I meant it as direct biology, that he was essentially a twin, even if he was created later because of the craziness of Kryptonian genetics and stuff. So we were going to pitch it, and we did our best. And then Mike took me out to this dinner, and, it was just like, it's the last son of Krypton for a reason. We're going to keep it that way. And, and I was joking. It was a very, very nice dinner. I got a good meal out of it, even though it was a letdown. But I loved having just that, it's hard to not be drawn to the allure of the dark mirror, right? Like it's so good. And Zod being such again, if the movies are one of your formative, pillars for Superman, Superman 2 is fantastic and Zod is terrifying. So, you have that in your head and then you're working on a thing. It's like, oh, well, what if Zod is Superman? Like, what do you get from that? And what happens if they switch places and all that kind of stuff? Those stories start to evolve. And it becomes even more poignant when you go, this is the Clark that was raised on Krypton as opposed to raised in Kansas. I think it makes for, would have made for some cool stuff, but we didn't get to do it.
At the same time, though, I really did enjoy what you were able to do with that character. And you find out he's the son of these Russian cosmonauts and genetically alters himself to look like Clark. And there does come a point where he switches places and all of that. Mm-hmm. And in terms of that intimidating stature and approach, you guys really conveyed that. I mean, the first time that they really come face to face, this Zod breaks Superman's jaw. So right from the jump, it's the sense that this is someone to be reckoned with. So, and people's mileage will vary, I guess, depending on when they come into this and what their knowledge is of the publishing history, but sort of taking into account where we were in the post-crisis landscape and that there were these restrictions on who and what you could and couldn't use. I appreciated what you guys were able to do with this version of the character. Did you end up watching the Superman and Lois TV series?
No, I saw that there was some cool stuff in there, but because every once in a while, like clips will come by, but no, I didn't watch it.
I don't want to spoil anything, but I would just say, if you're intrigued by the idea of Clark having a brother, check it out.
Okay.
Especially as I was rereading this and then learning more about what your original plans were, I was like, oh, son of a gun. Like, you ended up getting a version of that.
That's cool. That's very cool. Yeah. It's an idea that works.
Yeah.
But, it's funny. And, I don't know if you've talked to enough people that have worked with Mike, but he was a good editor in chief, cause he had been in the trenches and he had done plenty of work. And I always found him easy to work with. partly it's my makeup, but when something was out of his control, I just got it, and if something was within his power, he would try to do it. And 775 is a great example like that. When I wrote that script, I wrote it raw, and I sent it in as written. So it had curses in it. It had all this stuff in it. And Eddie sent it to Mike as is, like he sent it as it was. And so this, the story was that Mike was reading it, and he relayed this to me as well. And he's reading it, and he'll be like, no. And he's like circling things with red pen. No, take this curse out. Da-da-da. And then when Superman like turns dark, it's like, no. And he's like digging holes in the paper with his pen. No, what the hell's happening? Like, it's completely pissed off. And then he gets to the end and realizes what the gag is. And then he's like, all right, just take out the curse, which is great. But it could have very easily been like, no, I don't think we can do this because I know what you're critiquing. I know what the argument is you're making. And, we don't want to disparage, quote unquote, disparage another book or to even shine a light on that kind of stuff. And he chose not to do that, so that's kind of the best you can hope for.
Yeah. And what an all-timer it turned out to be. So I'm glad it moved forward, but that's really fascinating to know about how it came to be. And one of the other things that we were talking about with 775 recently was, is Clark actually worried about whether or not he can beat the elite? And I would love to get your take on this, because I guess my view is that maybe he's not entirely sure how the battle would go, but I don't really ever get the sense, just my own reader's interpretation, that that's what he's most worried about. I think it's more about this point that he needs to make and this lesson that he needs to impart to the people, what he needs to show them. I always took that to be more what he's preoccupied with or concerned about, as opposed, because we have Pa saying, can you beat them? We have Lois saying, I don't think you can, but I never really took it to be like, that's really what he's most worried about.
Right. Yeah. I definitely felt like he was not sure he was coming out of that fight like that. I think that's part of, if you take any of the commentary out of it and just look at it as a story, if he doesn't think that he may not walk away from that fight, you lose everything. So he's got a plan and he has an idea. And I think in Superman's mind, this is going one of two ways. Either I pull this off and I get to show the world kind of what they're asking for, or I die and they see that. And maybe I'm a martyr for it, but I don't know. I don't know any other way. I think that's sort of that's why, Lois saying, I don't think you can win. She's saying out loud what he's also thinking. Like he doesn't know if he can win. So yeah, I agree with you that it is at that moment, it's like, I can't, there's no other way for me to play this. I can't step down because it's too important. It's not an ego thing, right? It's just like, I can't let people think this is what the world is. We have to be better than that. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, it's fascinating to hear your perspective on it. One of my buddies, Mike, he's a massive fan of your work. And one of the things he asked me to ask you, and this ties back to what you were saying at the beginning about 775 and that it wasn't meant to be an attack on other creators or anything like that. Did you ever hear from Warren Ellis or Mark Miller about 775?
I don't think so. Like, off the top of my head, if I did, I don't remember. But no, I was never really in touch with either of them. So, I've met them both in passing, but believe it or not, over the course of time, never really hung out with either of them.
Gotcha. So I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up your artistic collaborators over the course of your run. So 775, an outlier in that you had Doug Mahnke and Lee Bermejo on the art duties on that, but primarily across your 50 issues of Action Comics, your primary collaborators, German Garcia at the beginning, then Kano for a while, Duncan Rouleau did a bunch of issues, Pasqual Ferry was with you for a while. I'm just curious what the relationship was like with any or all of those artists in terms of what they brought to it, things that they were particularly interested in pursuing, just kind of what that dynamic was like, how you wrote to them, and if there are any specific things that come to mind?
Oh, sure. I mean, it's like an embarrassment of riches that, which has honestly been the case for most of my career. I've been really lucky, especially on the mainstream books, to be either have the opportunity to bring in people who I like and whose work I admire, or to be assigned people that it's like, oh yeah, this is a home run. Like, thank God you gave me these people. Duncan and I became friends on the Juggernaut one shot that, I was new, he was new-ish, and we just became buddies like on the phone. We talk a lot and didn't wind up meeting in person for like a couple of years, I think, which is really great. And then of course, we're partners and have been together for a very long time in Man of Action. And Duncan just being so non-traditional, like it was always interesting because his issues are so polarizing for people because he doesn't draw like kind of classic, nothing remotely like classic Kurt Swan, kind of Superman, right? So people just go like, I don't know what to make of this. Anytime he's drawing like a really iconic character, but then you put him on like the Metal Men and people go, oh my God, this is sick. Like they just freak out. And it's the same art, it's the same guy. But because Superman, people carry certain really baked in notions, or Batman, God forbid you get the ear length wrong on Batman for somebody, right? Then they get really mad. So Duncan would have to ride that wave a lot. But like one of my favorite Duncan issues is there's one with Captain Marvel. And the kids and the, insane frog goddess and all this stuff. Like that was fun. And to give, Superman the Shazam power, was great. So Duncan always brings, so much stuff. Pasqual is one of the first people I ever worked with in comics, and to get to do Superman with him was such a joy. And he's so good at like the quiet stuff also. I was just at a signing this weekend and somebody had brought up there's like the Lois and Clark detective adventure, where they're looking for a guy who's gone missing. And I actually have a page from that book, and I just forgot how much I love the like just quiet Pasqual, and then of course when you want a big crazy action or really ethereal, like otherworldly stuff, like he knocks it out of the park. He's so good at that. German Garcia was like an incredible find. I met him at a convention in Spain and saw his work and was like, wow, would you remotely be interested? And then I showed his stuff to Eddie, and he brought this very cool level of like, it's hard. It's when somebody can sort of be cartoony and realistic at the same time. I don't know how it's like a Darwin Cook kind of feel, right? Herman doesn't look like Darwin, but there's something to it where you could feel both, like there's a gravity to the characters. And then Kano coming in, after him sort of had a similar thing going, maybe dialing up the cartoony a little bit more, but, and they were just, everybody was great. Everybody was, really sweet. And then, obviously, I knew I had McGinnis from Deadpool, we just had so many really talented people, on that Superman run. And Doug and I then obviously worked together, on JLA for a long time. And he's just such a massive talent, also. And then that led to Pac Leeson. It's like you get to sort of have all these people that are all connected. It's like Herman leads to Kano, and, Pasqual leads to a lot. Probably, I mean, I knew Pasqual. I'm trying to remember if Herman and Pasqual knew one another or not in the community in Spain. I don't remember. But yeah, it's all connected. It's like a big, weird, extended family. And I'm very, very happy to have, gotten to work with everybody. I hope I didn't forget anybody.
No, I think, those are the primary collaborators. Yeah, I am also a fan of your JLA run with Doug. And you also did, I guess, a relatively short stint on Superboy with Pasqual. Mm-hmm. Yeah. How did that come to be? And was it always meant to be that truncated? Because it felt like you guys did 11 issues, I believe. And I was just curious because on your other titles, obviously you had lengthier tenures. I was wondering if you had more planned, if things shifted.
Yeah, I think that was meant to go a little bit longer. And I don't recall exactly the timing of how that all shook out, but I love that stuff because Pasquale has such, like, his art just carries this youthful energy all the time. I love the way he draws young people. He's so good at it, and so him on Superboy was so fun. And he's got such a great sense of humor. Like, he was able to carry that stuff through. Yeah, I think we wanted to do more, but it just didn't work out that way for one reason or another. I don't recall exactly why.
Yeah, no, I'm sure, a lot going on. I do have to say, though, far and away, my favorite issue of your Superboy run was the War Letters issue that tied into Our Worlds at War. Just a magnificent, beautiful issue. I mean, I'm a fan of the Our Worlds at War crossover, and that's one of, certainly in terms of the quote unquote non-core storyline, the tie-ins and whatnot, far and away my favorite. Really loved it.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. It's funny. I was just talking to my son about, there's like a new movie coming out about a war movie from Alex Garland, and it's just called Warfare, I guess. And I definitely remember, like, having the conversations about not wanting to glorify certain things and wanting to be careful about it. And, you see it, you hope to see it in how people treat the stuff in general. And so to have an issue where it was like, we're going to talk a little bit about, like, the not fun stuff, and especially through the eyes of somebody young, that was the hope, that it would kind of resonate in that way. So, it's funny, anytime you work on something that's like a little more challenging, or the subject material is a little darker, it feels weird to be like, oh, I'm glad it worked. But that is the goal, that it's effective, right? For the audience in some way. Maybe, you want them to be entertained, but if you can also sneak one or two in that's like, oh, there's a little more going on, then that makes me happy.
Yeah, and I have to say, too, just about Our Worlds at War generally, I'm always curious to see different ways in which Superman can be challenged. And especially upon this reread, I really felt like you guys achieved that, because I think in terms of the losses suffered and just the unrelenting onslaught of the battle, you really see the toll that this takes on Superman. And especially in at least one of your issues of Action, where he's not there to save Sam Lane, and Lois is calling for him, and he's just so out of it. But you understand why. But it was, I'm off the top of my head, I can't think of another story where you really see him in quite that state. And so I love what you guys were able to do, and the fact, I guess, that you were allowed to kind of push him to that point, because it really stood out. And of course, you get him then to the other side, you get him through it, but it really put him through his paces.
Yeah, thank you. It's good to hear that. It is the single challenge, right, of writing Superman, really, is just, how do you get people to relate to a character who's, depending on who's working on him at any given time, either comes off as super overpowered or very, like, squeaky clean and one dimensional, all that sort of stuff. So for us during that time period, most of the conversations were about psychology, like, it was just sort of like, how do you have to get under his skin and into his head, and how do you do that? And overwhelm is one example. And we're always like, well, he's so fast, he can do whatever. Well, he can't if his attention is scattered across, practically a galaxy, basically, right? He has limits, and once you push any character to their limits, they're forced to make choices, right? And that's when you get the good stuff. It's why I will throw some dirt on one thing. It's why when you see Man of Steel and he doesn't save his father, you kind of go, I don't get that. Like, it doesn't ring true. It doesn't ring true that a guy who can move speed of sound couldn't have, like, saved his dad without hurting him, and nobody would have seen. It's that kind of thing. But that's because of the way it's set up. Like, that's actually internal to that movie. It's not just, oh, I bring in that baggage. It's like, I've just seen all this stuff. How is that not? It doesn't compute, But that is the challenge. Like, that is that, and the people who can sustain that, and hopefully, we were some of those people. That's when you feel like, oh, I really walked away with something, with Superman, and I could see him as a proper character, not just as an icon.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And with Our Worlds at War, though, I think really leaning into that war motif, and it set it apart from other stories where either they're fighting supervillains or it's a wave of antimatter energy. And I love all of those kinds of stories, but I think really hammering home that this is a war and he's not equipped to fight a war, and gets to the point where he says to Lex, like, I'm yours, like, tell me what you need me to do. And on that note, talk about some of these perfect moments or scenes of yours that I'm always quoting. There's a moment in Ending Battle. This is the point in time where Lex knows that Clark is Superman. And by the end of Ending Battle, Manchester Black will have erased that from Lex's mind. So it's a small window of time that we're playing in. But there's this scene where Superman tracks Lex down to his island hideaway and confirms that Lex knows Clark is Superman. But essentially, Lex talks about how he loves himself, he loves Lena, and he also loves Lois. And if nothing else, that keeps Superman safe, despite the fact that Lex knows his secrets. This is, I'm on the record, I'm not just saying this because you're here, I've said this so many times, like, this is one of my absolute all-time favorite Superman Lex moments. It 100% captures the dynamic that I always crave from them. And I think it's a perfect example of how even Lex knowing the secret, it can still work, and you can still, I love that moment so much. Anything that you recall that you want to share about it, I would welcome.
Oh, thanks. No, I'm glad to hear it. I mean, I love, Lex. I think Lex is one of the best villains, period, like, of comics, and very easy for any villain to get spun into sort of stereotypical, mustache twirling. But when you drill down on that guy, and you sort of get into his head, and certainly the modern era predates me by a long shot, of just, let's look at Lex as somebody who is misguided but actually does believe that he has stuff to offer to other humans, and whether that's just like, well, if you all listen to me, it would be fine, so therefore I will force you to listen to me. That's what makes him a villain. But yeah, the more human we could make him, the better. And certainly, once you get into, like, these two guys have been at it for so long, cracking that open and going, all right, well, he's supposed to be one of the smartest guys on the planet. Like, eventually he's going to figure this out. What do you do with that? What do you do when Clark is really confronted with how scary that could be? I don't remember much more, though, about that time period with Lex. He had been president. We had done a whole bunch of stuff, but I always adored Lex Luthor as a character. It's just great.
Yeah, no, I'm firmly in the camp of finding that for whatever reason, I always look for the best in Lex. I think it's because I'm such a huge fan of the Smallville TV series, and that was very formative. So maybe that's why. But no, because you don't want him to be one dimensional, and so to have a scene like that between the two of them, just like your scene with Clark and Pa that I talked about, or Clark and Lois, like, it just felt very real. Like, this is what a conversation between them would be like. I also have to say, going through all the President Lex stuff, putting aside where he ultimately ends up in Superman, Batman, Public Enemies, where he really goes off the rails, for a lot of this, especially through our Worlds at War, I know there's some shady dealings and whatnot, but overall, Lex proves to be fairly competent president, I have to say. That was one of the questions that we talked about in our recent episode. Like, is Lex a good president?
He's good for Lex. I mean, that's, I think he's one of those guys that, like, and again, these characters go through phases, right? So in the phase that we were looking at him, I think, there was a level of humanity, and it was sort of building from the, maybe one step removed from Superman's an alien, therefore Superman's an immigrant. Like, that part we didn't quite, I think, lean into. I wouldn't say that our Lex was anti-immigrant. I don't even think metaphorically, I don't think he was, but I think he was pro-human, right? And so when he got to the point of, like, I don't like it that they're just gods walking among us, so I need as much power as possible to protect my own, whatever that means. Sometimes it meant his own interests, but I do think that he believed it was his people, his country, humans. And so to that end, he was truthful, and I think the more truth a villain, sort of speaks, the better they are. And he always, very often lays that stuff out. He's got to have secret plans and machinations. So he's certainly doing stuff behind the scenes that is not good because he knows he's not going to be president forever. So, he's definitely laying all of his, future plans. But yeah, he did the job.
Yeah. I guess one of the other hallmarks of this era of the super titles, Lex related, is sacrificing his daughter to Brainiac 13 at the end of Y2K in order to retain control over the B-13 technology, which he leverages and really uses that to catapult himself to the presidency. And then you bring it full circle because you write the action issue that concludes Y2K where he gives up his daughter. But then the conclusion of Our Worlds at War, Superman is able to return his daughter, Lena. She had been aged up through Brainiac 13, but he brings back the infant. And this is another one of these moments of yours that I quote all the time where Superman returns the baby to Lex and says, "We're small men in a large universe, Lex." And essentially stop trying to be a god and remember what it means to be a man. I love that moment, but I love, you brought it full circle. Was it always the intention when he sacrificed her that Superman would make good on her promise to bring her back? Or was that did that change along the way?
I would love to say, yeah, we had that all planned. Maybe we did. I honestly don't know. I feel like something like that, we probably had an endpoint because, there are certain things. It's funny. I'm going through a lot of this stuff again, which is awesome, working on Spidey right now, where if you're working on a character that is a little more just not as iconic for one of the big companies, like maybe not front and center. All characters are cool and they all carry their own stuff. But when you're working on somebody that, they haven't made a ton of movies and billions of dollars on, you have a lot more latitude to take risks and try stuff that even if the character doesn't do something morally ambiguous, if it freaks people out, it's not going to get anybody fired, right? Basically, I don't even mean me, just, people who work in house. And then as you work on the bigger titles, that window becomes smaller. So the way you work around that is you make sure you have your exit strategy. So it's like, yeah, Lex is going to do this abhorrent thing. He's going to give away his own child. Well, then what? Are we going to see Brainiac just, keep her in a jar or what? And then it's like, well, we'll introduce this. She'll be a villain. And then maybe we can de-age her later, like that. And once people sort of have that, then they go, okay, you have a place to go. We'll let you try the scary thing. So hopefully that's what we did. It's also entirely possible that we did it and thought it was really cool. And then we were like, oh, this is a way to bring her back. But I'm pretty sure we would have had an exit strategy. Like, you just can't, like, some of these things that's why, like, you can't just kill characters off willy-nilly and stuff like that. Like you need to have a strategy because it's comics, and that's part of the wonder, the wonderful part of the soap opera is like characters go away, characters come back, all that stuff. But, we used to get like actual handwritten letters, back in the day, and Superman fans, especially, that is a wholesome title. Right. And even if, you try to put in some unsavory stuff, you're going to hear about it. And that was certainly the case. And I don't mean like the sort of trolling that happens online today or on social media. I mean, like, seriously well thought out letters about how this does not align with my values and that kind of stuff. We used to get that stuff. And maybe they still do. I have no idea. But, or like, one of the early ones you mentioned before, which is also one of my favorite issues, him with Wonder Woman, in Valhalla. Like, I was so proud of that issue. I was so excited, for all the reasons I said before. But also I love Wonder Woman. And it's like, I wanted to address the question. I just felt like this was something we, as fans, you've asked, since you're kids, like, oh, would these guys hook up? Right. And so then to get to do that, that's the sort of thing that if I went in with sort of a half-baked, I have the beginning, but I don't know what happens, it would never have flown, but self-contained, beginning, middle, end, it was okay.
It's funny with that issue. I've talked about this a lot. I feel like in the past, I always enjoyed the issue, but my appreciation for it has grown considerably because I feel like in the past, I always looked at it as like, it's 1,000 years. It's like Lois would want him to have some comfort before his final battle. But now, I get it. I get it because we wouldn't still be talking about it. And the lesson wouldn't have been as clear. And this vision, going back to this idea of your vision of the character, that would have been a different story. So it really needed to be this. And I see that. But that one is such a standout. I know I got to cut you loose and I promise I'm winding down. One of the things I have to ask you. So we talked about what your original plan was for Zod and how you had to pivot and whatnot. So all this business about return to Krypton and this idea that the Krypton wasn't actually what we saw in Man of Steel, this cold, sterile world, but was actually much closer to the Silver Age version of the planet. And Superman and Lois are able to visit by way of the Phantom Zone. So that's Return to Krypton. Then in Return to Krypton 2, the sequel, we find out that ultimately that Silver Age-y Phantom Zone version of Krypton was a program by Brainiac 13. Was that always the plan, or were you guys really angling for that Silver Age version of Krypton to be the Krypton?
I believe that was what we wanted. I really do. And I could not tell you honestly why it had to get undone, or if this was another good example of like, oh, all right, well, we did sort of take a big swing. And then the powers that be were like, we can't really contradict Man of Steel. That it's formative and it's a very critical story, whatever. And so then we had to, step away from it a little bit. But we kind of, at least in my recollection, or I'll just speak for myself, that box of comics that I had, that's what it was, right? That was the time period of those books. It was all pre-burn stuff. So that is my Krypton, right? Like that's the Krypton that I love. And trying to figure out a way to also meld movie elements and it in any way that makes sense to sort of not have all the cake and eat it too, but just again, there's room for everybody. So why does it have to be like this? And we'd kill that to take this, which is hard, right? That's always on a character that's been around for this long with time that's elastic or reboots or whatever, right? You make these choices. So sometimes people just stretch time forever, like they tend to do at Marvel. DC was much more comfortable with reboots and let's just start over. And I think it was an opportunity to go, hey, let's try to have both. Have our cake and eat it too. And then I'm sure there was a reason why we had to backtrack a little bit.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I appreciated what you guys did because you accounted for the Byrne version of Krypton, this idea that it was a false program that Jor-El had implemented because he wanted Kal-El to be able to acclimate more easily to his new home, to look forward, not back. So it's not like the other one was completely discarded. There was a reason for why it was presented that way. So to me, it worked great. And I was dying to ask you because, and I don't say this in a negative way or as a criticism, but reading those two stories, Return to Krypton and the sequel, the feeling was like that you guys were all in on this. And then it felt like, just reading it, I'm like, I wonder like what happened where they weren't able to like fully commit to that. So
yeah, and like I said, I honestly don't remember. I don't remember if there was like blowback or anything like that. It took, generally speaking, things. Everybody knows what's happening well before it comes out. It's really rare you have a baby in the microwave. We have to recall the book moment. We didn't really have any of those. So, and I don't know, maybe that could have also coincided with some of the movie stuff, which is also possible. Because that happens, once all these things became big corporate toys, as opposed to just in-house toys, it changes the nature of things. It's not necessarily bad. I mean, in a lot of ways, as much, I certainly have feelings about like corporate comics, but without that backing, some of these places don't exist, right? So, it's good and it's bad. So that could have been part of it. There could have been a little bit more of a coherent, like, hey, this is the strategy and the books have to align and, which kind of happens. But And even to being completely fair, my, our saying, hey, let's go back to Silver Age stuff, retconning Man of Steel, I'm sure pissed off a lot of people too, right? So it's like I'm doing the same thing that you hate when somebody does to you. When you happen to be sitting in that seat, you get to do it, right? Theoretically, with the blessing of the company. But that's I'm sure there are plenty of people that grew up. That's Man of Steel might have been their first Superman comic. And they're like, no way, man. I don't want the rockets with the red fins. I want this,
Well, for whatever it's worth, I'm one of those people who grew up with the post-crisis burned version of Krypton. And yet I remember when Return to Krypton came out, and I remember definitely it registered, oh, this is different, but I was there for it. Like, I was on board. I thought like, oh, this is intriguing. So, but yes, definitely a range of reactions depending on where people are coming from. This is really not much of a question, but more just a compliment. The issue that you wrote right before Critical Condition, it's the one that guest stars Batman, where Batman and Superman are looking for Lois, who's been taken by the parasite. Mm-hmm. Amazing. I mean, just one of my favorite Superman Batman team ups. And then you would go on later to write a Superman Batman annual that recounts their first meeting. One of the funniest. It's one of these things with comics. There's a lot of times where I'll read something I'm like, oh, that's funny. Very rarely am I like actually literally laughing out loud. And that's one of those issues that really made me laugh. So two very different Superman Batman stories, but I love them both.
Oh, thank you. Well, that first one, the detective story, there is stuff that Batman says it's direct quotes from my dad. Like, and if not a direct quote, a very, very minor extrapolation, talking to him about crime scenes and, what is it like to do an investigation. So I never got to write Batman as a solo book, but I think it's the only one of the few characters of the sort of big pantheon, right? I'd love to write a Spectre book. Nothing would make me happier than do a Spectre horror comic. But if I was ever going to do Batman, all the growing up the son of a cop stuff that's in my head, regardless of policing today, right? That's its own thing. My dad was a literal detective, and some of that stuff is in my head. So his voice is in there. And then that annual was, it was just an opportunity to just have a blast. It's because again, the comics that I had growing up, there was the chaos of like World's Finest and their kids are hanging out together from a different dimension or whatever. It was like, okay, cool. Those characters, I've said this before, like I think Batman is literally a bulletproof character. Like that character has been the silliest possible superhero. You've got 66, right? Which I love and I think is formative for a lot of people, and everything up to Frank Miller and now Absolute Batman, right? It's like he can contain it all. He really can. It's fascinating to me when a character can do that. Superman is almost there, but there is a point where you can break Superman. Like there is a point where you go, that's not Superman. And I know what that line is for me. I think we see it rarely, but it does happen once in a while. And I find that fascinating because you would think he is the most unstoppable, unbreakable character. But if you don't believe it, you can't sell it, and I think you have to believe, like they used to say in the movie, you have to believe a man can fly. You have to believe this guy is good, like that he is a good, wholesome person who cares about people. And if that part of the stool is kicked out, it collapses. Batman, you can run the gamut. You can go, yeah, he's really secretly a dad to all these people, and that works out great. Or no, he's a gritty loner who's kind of a fascist. Like it all works with Batman, but with Superman, that's not the case. You got to treat him in a different way.
Well said. Well, the last thing I'll ask you, as you look back on this 50 issue run on Action Comics, and I know you wrote other Superman stories and featured him in JLA and whatnot, but your time on Superman, I guess, did you achieve everything that you wanted to? Are there other Superman stories that you would want to tell? Just kind of how do you take stock of your time with the Man of Steel?
Oh yeah. I'm like I said, I was very lucky. I got to do I think I got to do everything I would have wanted to have done at that time period, both in the main book and certainly in JLA. Um, I'm not above working politics into comics. I actually think that there's a long history, precedent, and need for that. Not everybody always likes it, but I think Superman's an excellent lens to do that, because as a character who so tries to be open to people, he's receptive to different types of ideas, and yet has an innate goodness that when something's wrong, he knows it's wrong, right? Even if the system says it's right or whatever. I love that stuff. And I think we got to do those things. So I was very lucky, and it was not always a simpler time. 9/11 happened right in the middle of our working, and that certainly changed a lot of things and the conversation about superheroes in general. I think if I had the opportunity to work on Superman today, it would be a different kind of thing. There'd be a lot of things that I would want to bring up that unknown whether or not corporate would be willing to sort of mess around with, and unknown whether or not the audience would want it too, right? Because sometimes it's like people want to escape, and that's fine. Like, there is nothing wrong with that. I was just watching, my son and I are watching the Mission Impossible movies to get caught up for the new one. That is what I'm checking in for. I'm not worried about what is there. Is there a subtext? Are they trying to do, is there a metaphor? I don't care. I'm just going for a good ride. So I have no problems with that. But no, during our run, I think we got to do a lot of great stuff. I got crypto in. I got to do all that stuff. We had a really good time. So I'm very satisfied with my time with that character, and it really warms my heart that as you're looking back at that stuff, and when you guys talk about it, that it's that it left a mark. That's the best you can hope for, right? Is that you contribute a little something to this character who soon will be older than all living people on the planet, right? I mean, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. This period of Superman comics was so formative for me. It's unlikely I'd be doing this podcast if not for it. And I think about all the people I've come into contact, because of it. So it's really, personally, it really means a lot. And for this little seventh grader who was reading these issues as they were first coming out, this has been an absolute treat. I'm so honored that you took the time to do this. I know the audience will enjoy hearing from you. So I thank you so much for your time. And what would you like to share with folks? I know, as you were mentioning before, you've recently taken over the reins on Amazing Spider-Man. So what would you like to share with folks? Or is there anywhere you'd like to direct them if they want to follow you?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. And really, it's been great to talk to you, Anthony, and to just meet you and reminisce and go about Superman. I really do appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, you can find me generally as that Joe Kelly, kind of on Twitter and Instagram. I did just start a newsletter on Button Down. So that's buttondown.com/that Joe Kelly. That's a new thing. It's only going to be bi-weekly, so I won't be bombing people's stuff, but it'll sort of coincide with 2 weeks after each Spidey, talking about the issue a little bit, which I think will be fun. And then, just wanted to talk about writing and creativity in general, which is what I was doing on YouTube, but YouTube takes a lot of time for me. That's a lot of editing. So newsletter's a little more manageable. And then there's a lot, Man of Action has a ton of stuff percolating at all times, some of which we'll be able to talk about soon. But at the moment, just, go back into your archives and look at the fun Man of Action stuff over the years. But there's more coming.
Terrific. Well, I hope everyone will check that out. I thank you again. I want to thank our mutual friend, Scott, who put us in touch. So shout out to Scott. Thank you, audience. As always, I appreciate you tuning in. Make sure you come back next time. And until then, as always, it's about what you do. It's about action. My love of the TV series Smallville is well documented, and there's one Smallville podcast that's always at the top of my queue. Always Hold On to Smallville, hosted by our pal, Zach Moore. Zach and his guests bring great insight, passion, and humor to each and every episode, and the podcast will continue with more great Smallville and Superman talk even after their series coverage concludes. Listen wherever you get podcasts, and keep an eye out for the other shows under the Always Hold On To banner, including Arrow, Star Wars, and more. Fat Moose Comics, established in 1982, is New Jersey's best and oldest comic book store, Led by current owner Sean Hendricks, Moose has that rare, old-school comic shop feel and camaraderie, yet also remains a welcoming space for new fans. If you're looking for something and they don't have it, they can probably get it for you. They know a guy. Visit Fat Moose in Whippany the next time you are in the Garden State, and be sure to reach out via the Fat Moose Comics Facebook page. We all love the big-budget superhero films, but the world of independent cinema remains a place of unbridled creative freedom and entrepreneurial spirit. Whether you're an independent filmmaker yourself, or you just love movies, don't miss these New Jersey film festivals: Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, and Round Reel in Bloomfield. Submission information for filmmakers can be found at filmfreeway.com. Follow the festivals on social media for news about events, discounts, tickets, and much more. Support the show and receive exclusive content, including the spin-off podcast Beyond Metropolis, advanced listens, and more by becoming a member at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato. My sincere thanks to all patrons. Subscribe, rate, and review today via your platform of choice, and continue the conversation by joining us on social media. Links are in the show notes. Flat Squirrel Podcast is also home to another exciting episode in the Adventures of Superman, now covering the color era of the classic George Reeves series. Subscribe today.